Hello and welcome to today's sports psychology screencast. Today's focus is going to be on the individual difference of aggression. So as with all individual differences, we have to have a definition first of all. So we'll define aggression. After that, we're looking at four theories that propose a way that aggression is formed. So we have theory one, instinct theory. Then we have social learning theory. Then we look at frustration aggression hypothesis, which is then built on by a similar but slightly different theory called the aggressive cue hypothesis. Now, first up, you look at this and think, I'm familiar with social learning, but really you are familiar with all four theories, and I'll explain that very quickly now. So what we have here, as with all sports psychology theories, we have this idea of a trait approach, a social learning approach, and an interactionist approach. So if we look at this first up, we've got instinct theory then. It's basically a trait approach to aggression. Now, as we looked at with personality, we looked at this idea of a trait approach. It's exactly the same for aggression, but it's just got a different name called the instinct theory. Everything about the descriptors are the same, so you might see this now and start to remember something about trait, which will allow you to talk about where aggression comes from as proposed by the instinct theory. Down from here we have the social learning theory, and I'm sure you can make connections to what you did with personality there. So we've got the social learning approach here, and then we have the frustration, aggression, and aggressive cue hypothesis. Now, both of these theories are built on frustration leading to aggression. So straight away, as you can see, if aggression is an innate trait, frustration is the environmental trigger that causes that aggression. And it's then built on to talk about something called aggressive cues. So if we look at that, both of these are interactionist approaches. So it's a real good recap of your personality or generic psychology theories. But now we have to make sure we have specific names for the trait theory of aggression, which is instinct, and then we've got these two interactionist approaches to aggression. So if we move on then, let's have a look at the first two theories then. So the instinct theory, before we do that, let's have a look at definition. The definition very basic, and it refers to the intent to harm. So aggression is the intent to harm. This can be physical, but it can also be verbal. Okay, so the intent to harm outside the rules of the game. So when you are intending to harm outside the rules, it doesn't mean you always have to harm, but if you intend to harm. So that's simple, that's that. If we go through from here then, let's have a look at theory one. So what we're going to do now is look at the trait approach. It's called the instinct theory. So if we just get that down to here, so it's pretty straightforward here. So what it's saying then is we hold that aggression is an instinct, okay, that we've inherited. So if we go through from here then, let's have a quick look. So according to the instinct theory, as we know, it's a trait approach. We've still got the I and the N in there to help us get into the sentence. So according to this theory, it proposes that trait of aggression is innate. It's stable and enduring, stays the same, it endures across throughout your life, and it's consistent across situation. So, now, a slight difference to this theory is you have to have this idea that aggression could be spontaneously released at any time because we all inherit it. This theory says that all of us inherit the trait of aggression, and it can come out randomly at any point, or the term used is spontaneously. So get this bit in. So every individual has the trait of aggression. Okay, that's the key premise of this theory, and it can be spontaneously released at any time. So that is just a slight addition to what we always have for a trait approach. And then we have a look at a quick example. Now, what I'm going to do in the screencast is keep the example as similar to what we use for personality when we use the trait of aggression in that one. So if we go through from here then, for example, a boxer inheriting the trait of aggression and demonstrating it inside and outside the ring. Ultimately, your example for the instinct theory of aggression could actually be anything that involves somebody being aggressive, because ultimately you're saying that they've inherited it. Okay, so they've inherited it and can be spontaneously released at any time. But this just keeps to the ease of a concrete example that you've used that can transcend through both personality, and we can then have a look at it from aggression. So from here then, as we always have to do with regard to evaluating theories, we use the descriptors. Okay, we use those descriptors to kind of signpost our strengths and weaknesses. So if we go through from here, the strengths are quite simply using that translation word of innate. Aggression can be innate. Okay, then we go down to this bit here, consistent across situations. Some people are aggressive in all situations. Remember, we don't commit. We say that some people have shown this. So that is straight away from our first ever lesson in sports psychology. We looked at this idea of a trait approach: innate, situations, consistent across situations, exactly the same, can be, some people. And then from there, we flip it over. Remember, when we're doing this, we then have to look at this idea. Is it realistic that every single person inherits a trait of aggression and they can be aggressive all the time? No. Then remember, when we're looking at evaluating or giving a negative evaluation on one thing, we look ahead because we know what's coming next. We know the social learning approach. So if we have a look at that, too simplistic and generalised to say that that people are going to be aggressive in different situations, then we've got this: all humans aren't aggressive, so they haven't inherited the trait of aggression. And then finally, aggression is often learned, and the trait approach or the instinct theory does not take into account learned aggression. So if we go to social learning theory of aggression then. So if we start onto here, social learning theory of aggression then looks at it this way. So proposes that aggression is a learned predisposition, or it is learned, ignore that A. So if we know it's learned, I'll probably just let you have a think now. Where do we think it's learned from? Most of you will be okay doing that. So we know it's learned from. Where is it learned from? Who is it learned from? And how does it then become a permanent predisposition? So from here then, environment. So aggression, according to the social learning theory of Bandura, proposes that it's learnt from the environment that we're in. Okay, it's learnt from imitating significant others, or if you feel more comfortable, copying role models. And then once we copy a role model, being aggressive, and then we are reinforced by society, I suppose, it then becomes a permanent behaviour. Now, as we know, okay, imitation of significant others is more likely if the young person who is imitating or copying the older person or the significant other, if the significant other has certain characteristics, we know that that is going to lead to more likely copying of aggression. So imitation more likely then if significant others in position of authority, same gender, same race, or the message that is relevant to them. So if we go through from there then, example, we have to try and put this imitation of significant others and social reinforcement into an example. So let's have a look. Remember, we always start our example with a young person. So a young football player imitates Luis Suarez biting, friends laugh, and he continues doing it. That's one example. I'm sure you can think of others, which we'll have a look at in the lesson, but that is one example that we've used throughout personality, and we can keep it for aggression as well. Now, from here, strengths and weaknesses. So straight away, we should have an idea, this idea of a young person imitate Luis Suarez biting or being aggressive. You should be able to then directly take yourself to a study, okay, that showed some evidence of this. If you can think of the study that supports this idea of a young person imitating aggression, and then you can just justify that by saying there is some evidence, you've got your strengths. So if you look at this Bobo doll experiment, it supports this idea of learned aggression. And secondly, there is evidence that aggression can be imitated from significant others. Now, we know from here, once we've got these things in, evidence that aggression can be imitated from significant others. You know, a lot of people might have seen significant others be aggressive, but do they always copy it? Let's have a look. So from here, then, weaknesses. Not everyone imitates aggressive role models. That one here, remember, comes over as a double. And secondly, it doesn't take into account that some people inherit traits, because everything for social learning is based around learning aggression. So that's a nice easy one. 2 strengths, 2 weaknesses. That puts us right in the ballpark to get the highest marks we would need if this came up as a extended answer, but also if the question asks you just to evaluate the theory. Now, if we move on to our first interactionist approach then. So first interactionist approach is called the frustration aggression hypothesis. It's an interactionist approach. If I show you down here why. So let's have a look. I'll give you this kind of, sorry, you don't have to write anything at the moment, just listen. So let's just put this scenario in our head. A striker in football is trying to get past a defender either with the ball or without the ball. So basically, they're trying to get past them. Now, when the striker tries to get past the defender starts to pull his shirt. Okay, now if you think of that, the striker trying to get past a defender is their goal. Okay, now if you look down to here, we've got this on the diagram, goal. Now, if the defender pulls their shirt, their goal-directed behaviour is blocked. Them pulling their shirt is an example of an environmental change. So their goal-directed behaviour is blocked. Now, this environmental change, the shirt pull, causes frustration. Now, because of the frustration, this will lead to aggression, okay? So our first sentence we have to get across here, and I'll put it up at the top now, is this. Goal-directed behaviour is blocked, which leads to frustration, which leads to aggression. So defender keeps pulling the striker's shirt, which leads to the striker becoming aggressive. Now, the key thing on this theory, as you can see down here, is you've got aggression here. Now, this theory looks at this idea of successful release of aggression, e.g. managing to release that aggression, intending to harm someone. If you have a successful I suppose, aggressive act, it leads to something called catharsis, which is the release of stress. So we're going to have a look at a positive application of aggression first. So we go through from that. So if aggression is successful, this is known as catharsis. Okay, let's have a look at an example for that. So if you imagine now the striker keeps getting his shirt pulled when he's trying to get past the defender, and then when the defender gets the ball, the striker then puts in a really strong two-footed tackle against the striker, against the defender, and wins the ball. That is an aggressive act that's successful. So you could argue that this is against the rules of the game. So as we know of VAR, it's an intent to harm outside the rules of the game. But if you look at it this way, we see it often in sport where somebody goes in physically but they win the ball, okay, the referee plays on. Now that is a perfect example of somebody getting annoyed, frustrated, being aggressive, successful release of aggression by a two-footed tackle that wins the ball, catharsis, and that relieves stress. Okay, and that's what catharsis means, the release of stress. Now from that, as you can see, there are two ways that could go. Now, it could be rugby, for example. You get to put in a high tackle that's intending to hurt someone outside the rules of the game, but the referee, it's just about the referee sees it as acceptable or doesn't quite see it. You get to release that aggression, and suddenly you feel like you've released stress. So that's one application. We all know that sometimes you can go the other side of the line, and when that happens, aggression is unsuccessful. And in this case, the player can be punished, and if you get punished or the aggression is unsuccessful, the theory proposes, as we will all have found, that if you don't get to release that aggression, it can actually be frustrated, or if you get punished. So for example, striker is sent off for a two-footed tackle, and that then doesn't really release the stress and aggression. What happens is the failure of punishment, in this case the punishment gets sent off, leads to the player becoming more frustrated. You often see people kicking things on the way off, and that's an example of that. Now, if we move through from there then, let's have a look at strengths and weaknesses of the theory. So, on here, very, very simple way to do this. Use the title of, or even the description, I suppose, of the theory. So you're always looking at that, aren't you? Strengths: frustration can lead to aggression. Theory is called the frustration aggression hypothesis. It can. Doesn't always, but it can. Secondly, it's more realistic than saying we just inherit the trait theory. Thirdly, it takes into account the environment. Okay, so it takes into account the idea that environmental change, a trigger that will, trigger that innate trait of aggression that people have. So go on from there, the weakness, and this is a really important one. Again, we use that key trigger of the description or the name of the theory, frustration, aggression. Not everyone becomes aggressive when frustrated. Okay, and aggression can still occur without a trigger or an obstacle. Some people, again, we're going back to that innate idea, some people don't need a trigger. They just have that aggressive edge within them, or that instinct to be aggressive, according to the instinct theory of aggression. So, final theory then, if that's frustration, aggression, our first interaction is frustration is the environmental change, aggression is the trigger or the innate trait that's been triggered. Let's have a look at the next one then. Now, aggressive cue hypothesis was a build or development of frustration aggression hypothesis, and basically looked at it like this. If I could just get you to concentrate on this bit here, if we consider someone like an ice hockey player, okay, so we could use exactly the same situation. Ice hockey striker, for example, trying to get past a defender, but the defender keeps pulling his shirt. That could be something just to keep in your head. Now, the ice hockey striker's goal-directed behaviour is blocked. That leads to frustration. The key difference on this theory is basically it proposes that if you become frustrated, it doesn't directly lead to aggression. It leads to an increase in arousal. Now, we know arousal is our physiological and psychological activation and readiness to perform. So when it's saying, when your goal-directed behaviour is blocked, defender keeps pulling the striker's shirt, this frustrates you. Who doesn't get frustrated in that situation? But it doesn't directly lead to aggression. It leads to an increase in arousal. When our arousal goes high, this then, the kind of dictating variable as to whether people will be aggressive, according to this approach, is whether you have an aggressive cue present or an aggressive cue is not present. So what we're saying here then, if you have an aggressive cue present, increased chance of aggression. If an aggressive cue is not present, there's a decreased chance of aggression. What does that mean then? Okay, what is an aggressive cue? The best way to think of it could be a number of things. We're going to use the easiest example, and we're going to use a physical weapon that some sports performers have in their armoury. So let's have a look. God-directed behaviour block leads to frustration, it leads to an increase in arousal. When that arousal is spiked high, okay, this is what happens. If increased arousal alongside aggressive cue, this is more likely to lead to aggression. For example, an ice hockey striker, okay, hitting a defender with their ice hockey stick after a shirt pull, and it's saying that if you have something in your hand that you can harm them with, you're way more likely to do so. However, if increased arousal leads to frustration leads to increased arousal alongside no aggressive cue, okay, let's have a look at hockey player as our concrete example, there's less chance of aggression. So for example, if the ice hockey striker, when the defender pulled his shirt, lost his stick, then he suddenly hasn't got any aggressive cue. So therefore, there's less chance of aggression. So if I could just get you to kind of consider that, hopefully that makes sense. So ice hockey striker, all we're saying, arousal, frustration leads to arousal. If you have arousal plus something in your hand that you could hit someone with, e.g. an aggressive cue, more likelihood of aggression. Ice hockey player we'll use for that. I'll give you some other examples in lesson. Now finally then, have a quick look at the strengths and weaknesses of this. So frustration can lead to increased arousal, nice easy one. Aggressive cues can lead to aggression, and finally takes into account the environment. Okay, so again that's a good thing for it. Now these are the key thing here. People learn to walk away from aggressive cues. Aggressive cues, if you have them in your hand, it's not every time that a hockey player, a field hockey in England, for example, they don't hit people with their sticks all the time. Okay, people learn to walk away from when you're in an aggressive situation using a cue. Okay, so that's a really important point there. Okay, thanks, make good notes on this, and I will see you in lesson